Hello, welcome back to Stories from History, where we talk about, interesting stories from history, interesting figures, yada yada. You guys know the drill by now. Today, we're talking about another very interesting character, Spartacus. So I'm sure you've all heard about Spartacus, the gladiator who led a massive revolt against the Romans in about 73 BC, called the Third Servile War. Now, this guy was really cool because he was a gladiator. He could fight. He had the bronze, but he also had the brains too. And we see that he was a real thorn in the side for the Roman people. Well, not the Roman people necessarily, the Roman political institution, because so much of Rome depended on slavery. So having their slaves stand up and trying to fight back was a big problem, and Spartacus was at the head of that. It links back to, if some of you remember, the Crassus video that I dropped some time ago. You'll see that it was him and Crassus that had a run-in. But enough about that. Let's actually talk about this guy, Spartacus. So, truthfully, there's not much that is known about Spartacus's personal life. He didn't record anything. He didn't have any diaries or letters. There's only really accounts written about him after his death, like some time after his death, by guys like Appian and Plutarch. But what we do know is that he was likely a soldier before. He was likely trained in how to fight, disciplined, and he knew something of Roman tactics, military tactics. We know as a gladiator that he had to go through some tough conditions, brutal training. They were humiliating those guys on a daily basis too. So you can imagine that probably lit a fire under him, that wants to make him fight for freedom. And he was a leader, so he commanded respect and he shared hardship because his followers were not, some aristocratic troops. They were slaves, they were escaped laborers, they were peasants. But he managed to kind of turn this force into a real fighting force that was able to, repeatedly beat the Roman armies. So this tells us he must have had some charisma, he must have been courageous, and he must have had some kind of moral authority, because he wasn't just a commander, he gave them hope. But the story goes, it is 73 BC, and about 70 or so fellow gladiators all decide, okay, it's time to escape from this gladiator school. It was a gladiator school in Capua in Italy. And all of them decided to get together. They seized whatever they could. Kitchen knives, spits for cooking, scraps of metal, and they burst into the compound in a violent rush and fought their way out of the gladiator school. They fled and made their way to Mount Vesuvius, where they climbed up to the slopes and they had a little regroup. And by now, these guys were being hunted pretty hard. A slave breakout is always a scary thing. The Romans always were a bit afraid of, because there were so many slaves, they were a bit afraid if anything would go wrong. And they already had 2 servile wars before this, so this was the third one. And they got to the top of Vesuvius, and under the shadow of this volcano, that's when something changed, that these guys became organized. These guys started, forming a legitimate force that could fight the Roman military, and it became a rebellion rather than just a slave escape. So the Romans, they sent a militia under a man called Claudius Glaber, and he wanted to trap them on the mountain. So those guys were very confident. They came to the foot of Mount Vesuvius, they camped there, they looked up at the steep paths, and they thought, there's no way that this guy's going to escape. But Spartacus was a smart guy, and he studied the cliffs. He saw something that those Roman guys didn't see. These guys tied together some vines, some ropes, and climbed down the side of Mount Vesuvius in the nighttime. And they burst into the Roman camp when all these guys were asleep, confident, and overwhelmed all the soldiers and slaughtered everybody. And this was a big victory. This spread through Italy like wildfire, and a lot of slaves fled their farms, they fled their household, their fields, their mines. They all legged towards Spartacus's camp. And within a couple of weeks, there was thousands that stood under his command. Some say tens of thousands, some say more. But this alarmed Rome. Rome was like, okay, this isn't good. We can't allow this guy to keep roaming around and, possibly causes problems. No one wants their slaves, running around armed, actively fighting against them. So the Romans were on high alert. And, Spartacus wasn't just the type of guy leading a mob. He organized these guys. He drilled his fighters. He organized them into units. And he struck Rome when it was weakest. And he avoided heavy confrontations when the odds were poor. So this was bad, The Romans were sending, forces against Spartacus, and he was beating them again and again. And, Spartacus wasn't fighting to conquer Rome. At first, at least, he was fighting to escape Italy. Some ancient sources say that he wanted to lead his people north across the Alps, and just from there disperse back to their various homelands. But the sheer kind of number of escapees at this point, and I think the chaos of moving armies of families, and then also the kind of allure of possible wealth and, some Roman booty, all the riches they could get, I think that started to complicate everything. And the rebellion, which was once simply a rebellion, became a war for survival. And Rome, humiliated by this, prepared for revenge, which we know. Rome don't play. When it comes to revenge, Rome doesn't play. So, finally the Senate decided this is serious enough, and they entrusted the war to a figure we spoke about already, Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome. And this was a guy that was, determined to restore Rome's pride. He was looking for some military glory himself, and he was efficient, he was brutal. He imposed, brutal discipline on his legions. He even brought back the old Roman form of military discipline called decimation, which is where any deserters, they get the whole legion, and every 1 in 10 men, the other 9 have to beat him to death. So pretty traumatizing stuff. And Crassus was able to drive Spartacus south, and he hemmed him in with trenches to the south of Italy, and hemmed him in with trenches and walls that cut off his escape. And Spartacus never wanted to sit down too long. He tried to break out, and he did succeed, but his time was running out. He was barely able to secure passage across the sea, and was betrayed by pirates who promised to transport him. But his back was against the wall. They betrayed him, and he rallied his followers for one last stand. And in 71 BC, near the river Salaris in southern Italy, the rebellion ended because there was no surrender. Ancient writers say that Spartacus fought in the front lines, and he was cutting down Roman soldiers as if he was trying to make his way to Crassus himself. Apparently, when his horse was brought to him, he refused to flee, saying, "This day I shall prove myself a free man, or I shall die." So this guy's pretty epic, and he did do that. He died fighting, surrounded by the bodies of those who refused to abandon him. And his body was never found. So who knows? Maybe Spartacus conspiracy theory. Who knows where he could have went? But probably died. But the crazy part is that the Romans under Crassus crucified 6,000 survivors along the Appian Way. That's a long road leading to Rome. Their corpses lined the road like a grim reminder of what happens to slaves that step out of line in Rome. But regardless of that, the memory of Spartacus still held on. And history remembers Spartacus as a legend, which he is. This guy was a soldier, charismatic leader, a liberator, and he exposed some of Rome's greatest fears, that the foundation of its economy, which was built on slavery, was brittle, was fragile. You know, he didn't set out to remake the world. He just wanted to be a free man. And you know, many people resonate with him and followed that because he was the first to say no more. And he did earn his freedom in death. So, you know, Rome won the war, but it couldn't kill the idea of a guy like Spartacus, you know. And for centuries afterwards, he became a symbol of, you know, resistance to Enlightenment thinkers, as a proto-revolutionary, you know, to abolitionists, as a symbol of humanity defying oppression, to the modern imagination as a gladiator who rose from the dust to challenge the greatest empire ever. You know, maybe he didn't change Rome, but for sure he left his impact, his mark on its story, and changed history. So, you know, shout out to Spartacus, very cool guy. Well, a warrior, man. I mean, what more can you say? So yeah, just to follow up on a Crassus video. I hope you guys enjoy our little videos about some great people. If you have any suggestions, do put them in the comment section. Send a like, send a comment, send a subscription, share the video, and yeah, see you sometime soon. Peace out.